One frigid evening in Quebec City, as icy wind rattled the windows and snow blanketed the streets in a soft, unforgiving silence, a man sat alone in his modest home near the edge of Thessady's wooded boundary. The trees outside, bent under the weight of fresh snow, and the faint hum of his space heater was the only sound within. He sipped tea slowly, grateful to be inside warm and safe. The forecast had warned of dropping temperatures, but he hadn't expected the kind of bitter cold that made the floorboards creak in the air feel like needles against the skin. Then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible, scratching, timid but desperate, against the front door. At first he thought it might be wind, dragging a loose branch, or maybe the hinges settling in the cold, but the sound came again, deliberate, measured, alive. He stood up and approached the door cautiously, his fingers hovering above the deadbolt. Something about the sound didn't sit right with him. It wasn't the clumsy pawing of a raccoon or the whine of a stray dog. It sounded smaller, wounded. Even with a slow turn of the knob, he opened the door and froze. There, huddled in a tiny, pitiful mound on the icy porch, was a bobcat cub, no bigger than a house cat. The young creature looked utterly spent. Its ears were flattened against its head, first soaked and matted with ice, and its tiny body trembled uncontrollably in the cold snowflakes. Clung to its whiskers, its eyes, a new nearly gold, blinked up at him with a strange combination of fear and resignation. The cub didn't flinch or bolt. It simply stayed where it was, as if surrendering to whatever came next. Thaman didn't hesitate. Instinct overriding reason, he stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come on, little one," he murmured, crouching low and extending a hand. The cub, barely able to move, inched forward and stumbled over the threshold, collapsing just inside the door. It let out a noise that wasn't quite a meow, more like a wheeze stitched together with pain and exhaustion. The man quickly shut the door behind them, locking out the storm. He grabbed a soft old towel from a nearby basket and gently wrapped it around the cub. He carried the animal to the floor vent, where warm air streamed upward, and laid him down gently. The cub didn't resist. It barely had the energy to move. Its sides rose and fell in shaky breaths, and its small paws twitched as if from muscle memory more than intention. Up close, the man could see the bobcat was in terrible shape. Patches of fur were missing. One eye was partially crusted shut. There were scratches on its legs, and its nose was dry and cracked. He didn't know much about wildlife care, but it was plain the cub had been out in the elements far too long. Every visible bone, every thin tremor in the young body told a story of hunger and cold. He hurried to the kitchen. There wasn't much meat in the fridge, but he found a few slices of cooked chicken breast, which he cut in small pieces and warmed gently on the stove. Placing the meat in a shallow dish, he carried it back to the living room and placed it beside the cub. To his relief, the bobcat opened its eyes a little wider. It sniffed, then, with a shuddering effort, lifted its head, and began to eat. Slowly at first, but then faster, as if afraid the food might vanish. Its jaws trembled with effort, and it made soft, desperate sounds as it swallowed each bite. The man stayed nearby, crouched on the floor, his heart aching. Every movement the cub made was a struggle. He reached for his phone and hesitated. Who would know what to do with a wild animal? The zoo animal control. Then he remembered hearing about a group called One Cat at a Time, a rescue organization known for taking in felines in need. They mostly dealt with stray ferals and abandoned pets, but maybe someone there could help. He found the number online and dialed. A woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm but alert, the kind that suggested she was used to middle-of-the-night emergencies. I found a bobcat cub, the man began, unsure how ridiculous it might sound. It was on my porch. It looked like it was freezing to death. I let it in. He's small, maybe a few months old, injured, hungry. I don't know what to do. The woman didn't laugh or question him. She asked for his address and a few more details about the cub's condition. Then she said, "We'll be there as soon as we can." Relieved, the man hung up. He turned back to the cub, who had finished eating and was now curled into the towel, the side of his body rising and falling, in slower, more even breaths. A faint rumble like a tiny engine vibrated in the air. The bobcat was purring. The sound caught the man off guard. He had expected snarsphere, maybe even resistance, but instead, this wild little creature had chosen to trust in the quiet warmth of the house with food in his belly and soft heat on. His fur, the bobcat, was purring. It was so human in its gratitude that it made Damon's throat tighten. He moved close, unsure if touching him would hurt. But the cub didn't pull away. Instead, he nestled into the crook of the towel, leaning faintly into the man's hand. Ash gently stroked the space behind one ear. Outside, the wind screamed. Snow continued to fall in heavy sheets piling high against the door. The temperature would keep dropping through the night. Without intervention, without shelter, the cub wouldn't have lasted much longer. Damon knew that in his bones. He looked at the fragile creature now resting against the vent, and he didn't care that it wasn't a house pet or that it belonged to the wild. What mattered was that he was live here safe. He wasn't sure what would happen next or what the rescue team might decide, but he knew this cub wouldn't last another night on his own. To his relief, the volunteers arrived within the hour. The man had left the porch light on and paced the length of his small front room several times before he finally saw headlights cutting through the snow. A van rolled slowly up the icy driveway, and two people emerged, bundled in thick winter coats, carrying gear bags and a soft-sided animal crate. They walked briskly but carefully, their faces set in expressions of calm readiness. He opened the door before they could knock. "Inside," he said, voice hushed. "He's by the heater." They followed him into the warm living room. The moment their eyes landed on the creature curled beneath the towel, their surprise was visible even under layers of scarf and hat. "That's a bobcat," one of them said quietly, kneeling down without hesitation. "He's just a baby," the other murmured, unzipping a bag and pulling out gloves. "Ow, antiseptic and thick blanket." The man stepped back to give them space. "I wasn't sure if you'd come. I know you mostly work with house cats." "Technically, we do." The woman said, her voice low and reassuring as she reached toward the cub. "But when something like this lands on your doorstep, you don't say no. He found you. For a reason." The cub stirred as she approached, lifting his head. Slightly, Thaman braced himself, unsure how the bobcat would respond to strangers. But instead of hissing or retreating, the cub let out a faint exhale, almost a sigh, and laid his head back down as if the sight of gentle hands was enough to quiet any instinct to run. The volunteers worked quickly but with extraordinary care. They scanned the cub with practiced eyes, noting the visible wounds, scratches on his legs and flanks, a crusted eye swelling along one paw that suggested an untreated sprain. His fur was filthy and tangled, peppered with small black specks that told them fleas had been feeding on him for some time, and the raspy rattle in his chest with every breath confirmed what the man feared most. The cold had triggered a respiratory infection. Still, the cub did not resist. He remained shockingly still through the entire assessment. When one of the volunteers gently cleaned the area around his eye, the bobcat pressed his head lightly into her hand. When they checked his swollen paw, he let out a sound. Not of protest, but of relief, as if grateful someone was finally helping. Then faint and steady came the purring. At first they thought it might be a trick of the heater humming behind them. But no, it was coming from the cub. Real, unmistakable purring, the kind that vibrated through his small body and softened the air around them. One of the volunteers, an older woman, with salt and pepper hair pulled into a low bun, actually paused, her hand resting lightly on the cub's shoulder. "He's purring," she whispered. "I know," the man said. "He did it when I fed him." They exchanged a glance. It wasn't typical for willed animals, especially bobcats, to purr like that, at least not around humans. But something about this cub was different. There was no fight in him, no fear now that he was being helped, only trust, only peace. They bundled him gently in a fleece blanket and tucked him inside a padded crate lined with warming packs. Before they closed the door, one of the volunteers paused. "He needs a name," she said, looking at the man. He didn't hesitate. "Asen." The name had come to him the moment the cub leaned into his hand, earlier the syllables soft and solid. The volunteers smiled. "It suits him," the woman said, strong but gentle. The man watched them carry the crate to the van. and load it carefully into the back. He stood in the doorway, long after the vehicle had disappeared into the snow, a strange ache blooming in his chest. He hadn't realized how quickly the little creature had carved out a place in his heart. Back at the rescue facility, the team wasted no time. Asen was given a full exam by a veterinarian, his wounds disinfected and bandaged, his lungs treated with antibiotics and warm oxygen therapy. He was too weak to be bathed all at once, so they cleaned him in stages, letting him rest in between. He accepted every procedure with a kind of solemn grace, never snarling, never struggling, always purring softly through the discomfort. The days passed slowly, but Asen began to heal. The infection that once rattled in his lungs began to subside. His fur, though still thin in places, grew softer and started to fluff up as he groomed himself again. He began to gain weight. Small ounces at first, but enough to give his limbs strength and his posture dignity. He was housed in a special recovery enclosure, warm and quiet, with soft bedding and a view of the woods beyond the facility. When the sun broke through the clouds and touched the floor near his window, he would stretch his lean body across the light, blinking slowly as if letting it soak into his bones. He was visited often by staff, by volunteers, by the man who had first found him. Each time Asen greeted them with the same calm trust. He would rise slowly, approach the edge of his space and lean into the hand that offered a stroke behind the ears. They'd never seen anything like it. Most bobcats were elusive and guarded, even the young ones. But Asen seemed to sense that he belonged here, that the people around him were his pack now, and as here covered, his personality blossomed. Eventually, one of the volunteers, touched by Asen's quiet courage, decided to take him home permanently. She had been there the night he was rescued, the one who'd first knelt beside him and gently cleaned the crusted wound around his eye. Over the following weeks, she'd visited him every day, sat with him through his recovery, spoken to him softly as he purred, through procedures that would have terrified any other wild creature. There was something about him, something more than his injuries or his silence. He had presence, depth, like he was watching, listening, absorbing everything with an old soul in a young body. When she brought him home, she prepared everything with care. A secure, spacious indoor area was set up just for him, complete with climbing platforms, warm bedding, soft blankets, and even a wide window seat, where he could sit and watch the snowdrift past the trees. Though Asen was a wild animal by species, he had a temperament that made cohabitation possible. Even gentle, her home was already a haven for animals in need. So she understood how to read signs of discomfort, how to give him space when he needed it, and how to offer calm when he sought connection. At first, Asen explored, slowly pacing the edges of the room, scenting everything with cautious sniffs, but it didn't take long for him to begin. Relaxing, his steps softened, his ears stayed upright, and his tail no longer tucked low in suspicion. He found favorite spots: a wide shelf beside a radiator where he could sprawl and nap, a hollowed-out tunnel lined with fleece where he retreated during thunderstorms, and the windowsill where he watched birds with a patient, curious stare. His eyes gleamed more now, amber and alert, but no longer dulled by exhaustion or fear. And he wasn't alone. The volunteers' home was also home to a number of rescued animals, each with their own story, their own wounds, and their own second chances. Among them was a spirited ginger cat named Cleo. She was lean and elegant, with a coat that glowed like fire in the sunlight and eyes that missed nothing. Cleo was confident, a little mischievous, and not easily impressed. But she noticed Asen immediately. Their first meeting was cautious. Cleo approached slowly, tail upright and twitching, as Asen sat watching her from his perch. She circled him once, meowed sharply as if to test his reaction, and flicked her tail. As blinked slowly, not a twitch of aggression, no attempt to dominate or retreat. He simply watched her with quiet interest, then stretched one paw forward and laid his head on it, entirely at ease. Cleo hopped up beside him. That was the beginning. Over the next several days, the two began to move in sync like a pair of dancers, slowly learning each other's rhythm. They chased each other in playful bursts around the house, tapping and pouncing. With surprising gentleness, Cleo would initiate games by darting into a hiding place and chirping, waiting for Asen to give chase. Asen, graceful and quick despite his size, would dart after her in soft pursuit. And when the sun poured through the window, they'd nap side by side, bodies curled close. Cleo's tail sometimes draped over Asen's back. At night, Asen often chose to curl up on the rug near the volunteer's bed, but more often than not Cleo would, already better sprawled across the patch of warm floor, rather than claim a separate spot, as would stretch out beside her, their backs touching their breathing, eventually falling into the same slow rhythm. It was a bond that surprised even the volunteer. She'd seen cats get along. She'd seen them tolerate each other, coexist peacefully. But this was different. Cleo and Asen had something else. Trust, a kind of unspoken agreement between survivors, who knew the shape of loneliness too well and had chosen not to feel it. Anymore, Cleo seemed to understand Asen's past without needing it. Explained. She didn't crowd him when he needed solitude. She didn't flinch when his dreams caused his legs to twitch in his sleep. She simply stayed nearby, present, patient, and reassuring in the way only animals can be. Together they built a bond that radiated warmth and safety. Now Asen is around 8 months old, strong, healthy, and thriving. His coat is thick and lustrous, the creamy underlayer blending seamlessly with the russet and gray hues that ripple down his back like a living tapestry of survival. His paws, once cracked and swollen from wandering icy streets, now press softly against hardwood floors as he roams his new home. With the silent grace only wild creatures possess, every inch of his body speaks of recovery. Not just physical healing, but something deeper. A restoration of dignity, of trust, of peace. He no longer has to fight for scraps or survive blizzards. Gone are the days when hunger gnawed at his ribs and each breath was a gamble against frostbite. He doesn't need to flinch at every sudden movement or sleep with one eye open. There are no cars to dodge, no wind to howl him awake. No alley dogs to challenge him for whatever he might find in a tipped-over trash bin. Those days belong to a chapter closed, not forgotten, but no longer feared. His bed is now a soft fleece-lined basket tucked beneath a bay window, where sunlight pours in for most of the day. Sometimes he sprawls across it like royalty, one leg dangling lazily over the edge, tail flicking gently with contentment. Other times he curls tight into a ball, pressing into the warmth as if savoring it. For all the nights he went without, the house is quiet, calm, and filled with comforting rhythms, clinking food bowls, whispered conversations, the low hum of a nearby heater, the occasional chirp of Cleo demanding attention. Asen's food dish is always full. His water is always clean, and every day his caretaker speaks to him not in commands but in conversation. If Asen understands every word, maybe he does. He certainly responds. A flick of the ears when he hears his name, a low purr when he's praised, a gentle nudge of his forehead when he wants affection. He's learned to live not just safely but joyfully. He has a family who loves him fiercely, not in the way people love exotic pets or rescue animals to brag about. No. This love is quiet and fierce, built on respect, admiration, and a kind of reverence. They don't treat Asen like a trophy or a novelty. They treat him like someone who has been through something. Someone who has earned the right to choose when to come close, when to curl beside you on the couch, and when to perch alone in the window to watch the snowfall. The volunteer who adopted him still remembers the way he looked the night they met. Frail, hollow-eyed, half-frozen. Now she watches him leap, effortlessly, to the top of a bookshelf, his muscles fluid and sure, and marvel. Set the contrast, she often finds herself whispering, "You made it." Even though he never needed the reminder, she did. Cleo too has changed. Once the queen of the house, she now shares her realm with Asen without complaint. They nap in tangles, offer grooming each other with slow rhythmic licks. Sometimes Asen will bring Cleo, a toy, dropping it in front of her, and stepping back like an offering. She usually ignores it. Then 5 minutes later, she's chasing him down the hallway, in mock protest. Their friendship is not loud or dramatic. It is steady, as if written into the walls of the house itself. His days are filled with affection, play, and the quiet joy of simply being safe. He spends his morning sunbathing and watching birds from his window perch. Afternoons are reserved for games, gentle ones with Cleo or solo chases after fluttering dust particles and dangling strings. In the evenings, Hefton sits in the kitchen doorway, silently observing as dinner is made, as if reminding his family that he is there watching over the ones who once watched over him. And sometimes when the moonlight spills through the windows and everyone else has gone to bed, as roams quietly through the house patrolling, like a guardian, not out of fear but out of memory of who he used to be and who he is now. To the man who opened his door that night, and to the rescuers who never gave up on him as more than a willed animal, he's a reminder that sometimes what we rescue ends up rescuing us right back. That one small act of kindness on a stormy night can ripple outward, changing lives, softening hearts, mending invisible wounds. That there's magic in compassion even when given to something clawed, silent and wild-eyed. That trust once broken can heal. And to this day, Asen greets everyone with the same gentle curiosity he showed that first night, without fear, without hesitation, and without the slightest unease.